Thanks for joining. We're going to talk about what exactly is an integrated preparedness plan and how do you write one. We will jump in. I'll do a quick introduction in just a minute, but let me talk about the agenda first. So the agenda is really just that, to review the integrated preparedness plan, to talk through participation of development of the IPP or the integrated preparedness plan, and then we'll focus on development of the IPP. Particularly, we'll focus on utilizing the IPPW, which is the Integrated Preparedness Planning Workshop. Our learning objectives for the day are to ensure that you have an increased understanding of the concept of an integrated preparedness plan, to ensure that you as a participant understand the concept of the IPPW and how to facilitate an IPPW, and to understand the resources available to guide development of an IPP and facilitation of an IPPW. So with that, those learning objectives, what we're going to do is actually follow through one of the tools that is available for this and available for creating an IPP and for facilitating an IPPW. And then as we go through that tool, we're just going to give you some tips and tricks and some considerations for each step of the way and try to make it very practically applicable to you and how you might use that tool in your world. So by way of introduction, who am I, why am I talking to you, and what in the world's going on with this? This project was funded and organized by the Minnesota Department of Health. My name is Will Moorhead, and I'm the president and one of the owners of All Clear Emergency Management Group. And the Department of Health engaged us to facilitate a project around improvement planning. And so we've been working on creating and improving more effective after-action reports and improvement plans and helping people understand that process, as well as to help them create documents that they will use and to understand how they can make that a living document as an after-action report or improvement plan. And of course, any after-action report or improvement plan has goals and looks ahead into the future. And that's a lot of what the Integrated Preparedness Plan does, is it helps us look at all of our exercises, all of our responses, all of our assessments of capability and our assessments of our response, and try to roll that into a plan for the future to say, these are the things we need to train on, these are the things that we need to exercise, and these are the partner agencies we need to work with. And so the after-action report and improvement plan is an element of the integrated preparedness plan. And you'll see as we go through today how those interrelate. And so that's really what this whole project is about, is trying to maximize your time and energy and efforts around improving your emergency preparedness and emergency management programs. Today, the methodology that we're going to use is this is very much a how-to. And so I'm going to walk through a tool that guides you through developing an IPP and facilitating an IPPW. And as I mentioned a minute ago, there will be tips throughout. And if you're looking at the screen, there's a little icon that I have put in the slides so that if you're reviewing, you'll know that there's an icon with a skull and some gears to indicate thinking, and that your brain is grinding away. And that's what this is about. It's just, hey, here's a concept. Now here's something to think about. And so as I go through today, that's really the methodology, is here's some concept or idea that's being presented, and then here's something to think about as you execute those ideas. So we'll jump in. Let's just talk about the integrated preparedness plan. I want to overview the nuts and bolts of the concept very quickly, and then we'll get into the how-to. If you're not familiar with this, an IPP is intended to document, and just straight off the bullet there, the overall preparedness priorities and activities for your jurisdiction or organization. The graphic that's provided is from the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program. It looks at the preparedness cycle, and if you're familiar with that, it's the idea that we plan and organize and equip, and we train and exercise, and we evaluate and improve, and then we start over with our planning. And it's kind of an ongoing cycle based on our threats, hazards, and risk, and based on our preparedness priorities. And so how do we establish preparedness priorities, where did that come from, and how do those get incorporated? That's what the Integrated Preparedness Plan is about. So we're going to incorporate all the elements of that cycle. And the idea is that we look at that to understand and improve the jurisdiction or organization's capabilities. Now, your capabilities come from the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Program funding or the Hospital Preparedness Program funding. You might be also receiving emergency preparedness guidance or dollars from another program. Great, nothing wrong with any of that. It's just the idea is that we don't want those to exist in silos. And so we want communities and community partners to be working together, and for this to be an opportunity for hospitals and public health and long-term care and emergency medical services to all understand how they interrelate and to plan, train, and exercise together around that. The idea of an IPP is to create that opportunity and to document it. So again, just a couple of thoughts straight out of the content from the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, that the Integrated Preparedness Cycle, as this says, provides your jurisdiction a continuous and reliable approach to examine the progress of improvement toward the ability, and then we can say those same words, prepare for, respond to, recover from, and mitigate the threats, hazards, and risks for most relevant to your organization. In other words, we just need to talk about together how we're going to plan and respond and recover from events, and we need to do that in some sort of an organized fashion. HSEP, as I've said several times, the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program, was updated in 2020, and this terminology of IPP came as a part of that. And so I'm going to deconflict a little of that because you might be familiar with some different terminology that is very, very similar in its intent. But the idea was to make a more user-friendly document or documentation around the Integrated Preparedness Program. The capabilities are more focused on whole community, not just core capabilities. So again, that's where if you're FEP and HPP, the idea is that we're going to bring whole community preparedness around, not just the core capabilities. And core capabilities often focus on those organizations that are in the business of emergency preparedness. And there are some others who aren't familiar with core capabilities. And so how do we bring them into the planning, training, exercise activities as well? And it was updated to change a little bit around senior leaders to really include decision makers, not just the appointed and elected officials, because again, many of you are doing the lion's share of the emergency preparedness work. And so we wanted to make sure that the Integrated Preparedness Program concept included those people, not just the elected folks. So the doctrine was updated in 2020. The Integrated Preparedness Cycle was defined as a continuous process of planning. I won't read you the whole thing, but a cycle was defined. But to accomplish or understand that cycle, the Integrated Preparedness Workshop was defined, which that's a meeting that establishes that strategy and structure for exercising and planning and training. That meeting produces the Integrated Preparedness Plan, a document. So it's a process that uses a meeting to create a document. You probably are familiar with TEPWs or MITEPs, so training and exercise plan workshops or multi-year training and exercise plans. Now the terminology is an Integrated Preparedness Plan workshop and an Integrated Preparedness Plan. So we went from TEPW and MITEP to IPPW and IPP. And just a little more background on that, FEMA said, hey, this doesn't support the integration of risk assessments and planning efforts and grant priorities and other things. So the idea of going from TEPW to IPPW was to address the gaps that FEMA identified. So there's nothing magical about this. It's just to take a more inclusive and a more in-depth look at preparedness, and thus the word integrated in it. The final bullet down there, it's a plan for combining efforts across the elements of the Integrated Preparedness Cycle to make sure jurisdictions and organizations have the capabilities to handle threats and hazards. You notice it's jurisdictions and organizations, but that is plural. It's together to handle the threats and hazards. So it does take a big picture look. A couple of things that if you're reviewing this at some point or you're curious or why we landed here, and I won't belabor the point, but the IPP cycle was introduced in those changes to be a deliberate approach to multi-year preparedness. And the priorities are developed, that last sentence in the first bullet, priorities are developed to ensure the needed preparedness elements are incorporated through this continual and reliable approach. And you notice they've said that in a couple of places about being continual and reliable approach. You also notice the achieving whole community preparedness. And I've said that a couple of times. but then also the final couple of words, consistent and measurable. And so this was an attempt to expand what we were doing and to make our training and exercise plans more detailed and more inclusive. Again, that last bullet, aiming to ensure risk assessments, plans, and trainings are scheduled and conducted prior to conducting exercises. Instead of just scheduling exercises, we were trying to schedule exercises based on risk assessments, exercises based on newly developed or newly improved plans, exercises that are supported by training that has taken place. So again, the idea of creating this inclusive program. I mentioned that an IPPW is a strategic meeting. We're going to walk through how to do this. We're going to follow the HSEEP tools all the way through and give you some tips and tricks on that. How often it should be conducted? Periodic. And what the period is kind of depends on the jurisdiction and the people involved. But it is a multi-year schedule. So it could be every 3 years. It could be every year if there's big changes. And you'll see as we go through the process that your whole community approach and who's involved, that may change and that may evolve. So you don't have a set schedule necessarily. It's not necessarily annually or always every 3 years. It could be every 3 years, but then a bunch of changes occur, and so you adjust to make it every 2 years or something. With that, enough background on it. Let me just walk you through how you do this. And I'll try to move quickly because this is recorded. You can stop and speed up, and then there will be some contact information at the end that you can reach out if there are questions as well. So the common IPPW, the Integrated Preparedness Plan Workshop agenda, looks like this. Some of these slides are the content from HSEEP, and so they provide this schedule for us. And we're going to walk through that agenda and each element of that. And as I said, I'll just give you some slides on thoughts or considerations as you try to implement these sections of agendas. So we'll start, and we would introduce our participants to the purpose of an IPPW and help them understand that we are looking at the range of preparedness activities integrated with our preparedness cycle. This is guidance provided by senior leaders. We'll talk about that in just a minute, and there's actually a section of this of how you incorporate the guidance by senior leaders and how you would solicit that. We identify and set preparedness priorities, again, senior leader guidance, but also based on what we learn from assessments and from after action reports and improvement plans. And then we schedule preparedness activities into that multi-year integrated preparedness plan. So we'll walk through each of these, and your workshop would walk through this, and you would be introducing participants to this concept. Hopefully, they have looked ahead and they understand the basics of the concept as they arrive to your meeting. One benefit of this meeting, but also some potential homework you may assign people, is to review the Integrated Preparedness Plan. So you would provide highlights from the previous multi-year IPP and an update on progress that's taken place. I would recommend that you send a little read ahead. It just makes the time go faster. And if you've got 3 or 4 hours with these people, you'd rather be trying to schedule and organize tasks and activities instead of updating on what's been taking place. A training schedule that you might look back on or you may send out, it looks like this. MDH provided their Public Health Emergency Preparedness multi-year training schedule. And you see that it outlines the name of the MDH division, the name of the training course, the proposed number of trainings, the proposed dates and locations and audience, the capability that's applicable to that training, the gaps the training is intended to address, and the funding stream that will be supporting that training. Here's another look at the PHEP, the Public Health Emergency Preparedness and the Hospital Preparedness Program multi-year exercise schedule. Same idea, that we look at what are the exercises and then some details about dates and locations, the target audience, the applicable capability, and the gaps to be addressed. So you might send this out or you might have people take a look at it. One advantage to a little bit of homework ahead of time is they understand this is an element of what you will be trying to produce. So if people have never participated in one of these, when you bring them together, you want to paint a mental image of what we're trying to accomplish today. And so it is this kind of detail that you're trying to gather as you go through the workshop. So you would dive in. and get them into the work part of the workshop. And I'm just going to walk you through each of those and again, give you some ideas for how you would implement that. The workshop activities, there's 2 slides that kind of preview those. The IPPW, the workshop focuses on primary activities and associated tasks. So it's not the very granular tasks. You think strategies and tactics, we're really focusing on goals and strategies rather than all of the tactics. You are going to talk about identifying preparedness priority factors. And so you're going to identify threats and hazards and risk. I would recommend, and the reason that there's a little icon and that sub-bullet is in italics, is I would recommend that you focus on those things that hinder the organizations from meeting their mission, right? So don't focus just on a particular event. What is it about those events that cause organizations to not meet their mission? And the reason this is important, when you're trying to merge risk assessments, if a hospital brings their facility risk assessment and their risk assessment says medical gas failure is one of our big concerns, that isn't necessarily a regional concern. What the regional concern or the concern of the stakeholders in the room that are focused on the IPP, what their concern is the hospital not being able to meet its mission of accepting and treating patients. Because medical gas failure is something that's specific to the facility and it's created for specific reasons within that facility. But your law enforcement, EMS, your long-term care, et cetera, their biggest concern is when the hospital goes down for whatever reason. So help people focus on those sorts of things as you talk in this community approach, the bigger picture. You'll be identifying validated and non-validated areas for improvement and capability assessments. And the reason I say non-validated areas for improvement, some of it may just be the gut feeling of people, and that's okay as well. Just because they haven't experienced an active shooter event in their community doesn't mean they don't have some concern around it. Identifying those external sources and requirements, there are funding streams and there are sources of information and guidance. And so understanding those, identifying accreditation standards or regulations, the Joint Commission credits or organizations like the Joint Commission accredit hospitals, and they require the hospitals to have certain standards and certain activities. And so that's what we mean in terms of identifying preparedness priority factors. And that's going to be a workshop activity where you need to think ahead how you're going to do that so you don't get wrapped up in the details of those preparedness priorities, that you can, maybe this is homework that you have people bring, is to say, what are your priorities for the year? You will then establish those, and again, I'm going to walk through the steps of each of those, but you'll establish those preparedness priorities. You'll develop a multi-year schedule where you identify those elements that I showed you on the chart, the planning element, the equipment elements, the training opportunities, the potential exercises, and you'll build that multi-year schedule. And then you also need some sort of program reporting. So those are the elements of the workshop. I'm going to walk you through each of those activities now. Activity 1 is identifying those preparedness priorities. I just said a minute ago, you might want to have some people do some homework. So let me give you a little bit about what that is, and it might give you some ideas for how to assign that homework. As you're identifying those preparedness priorities, you're looking at those factors, as I said, that hinder preparedness or hinder response within an organization. The HCEP information is those 2 major bullets. Identify the applicable factors, and then the list of factors is intended to help organizations consider the full range of factors impacting their preparedness activity. Great. What does that mean to you? It means look at the things that hinder the organization, or don't focus on training and exercise. Consider also the plans and purchases and relationship buildings or the development of new partnerships. In other words, as you identify, hey, we need to work on these things over the next 3 years, don't just focus on, we need to make sure we check the box for some exercises, but think about, do we need to include these people? Is racial inequity something that we need to talk about? Do we have underserved populations? Do we have an access and functional needs challenge? Are there plans that need to be developed over the next few years? Do we need a plan for how we will coordinate emergency medical services and transport? And focus on those things, because then that will inform the real vulnerability. It's not just pulling out your hazard vulnerability assessments and comparing those, but really understanding why you have the vulnerabilities you have. The activity that's in place for that, and this is the HSEEP slide, is to identify the threats, hazards, risk, and the improvement capabilities, but they don't give you a lot of detail about how to do that. So I would suggest that you consider some virtual and some in-person meetings just for this, to identify your threats and hazards and risks, that maybe you have some conversation ahead of your workshop. You send out an agenda, have everybody bring whatever data or information you're asking them to show up with, and include some people who are not the STP, the same 10 people, but some new people with some new experience. This is a real challenge. You'll get people in the room, and if they don't have their vulnerability assessment with them, then they're kind of speaking off the cuff. If they do have their HVA or their risk assessment with them, unfortunately, you may then, as I said, be trying to compare like medical gas failure for a hospital with active shooter for a public health agency, and they just don't align. So you really need to have some conversation about why certain things are the threats, hazards, and risks to the jurisdiction or organization. So this is the activity that's provided by HSEEP, and so it doesn't give you a lot of detail about how to actually do this, but what you're trying to do is that number 2 over there on the instruction. As a group, you're developing a list of the top threats, hazards, and risks impacting the jurisdiction. You're recording those, and then you're going to brief one another on what that is. So you could, in small groups, do this. You could, as I said, do this as homework, and then have people be prepared to report out what they see as the biggest risk and hazards for the jurisdiction. Remember, this is jurisdictional focus. It's not individual agency focused. And so my root cause analysis about a snowstorm is when somebody says, hey, snowstorm is high on our HVA or our risk assessment, have them talk about why that is. If they say, well, it's because the roads are impacted, okay, what is it that occurs to your organization when the roads are impacted? If they say, well, the hospital has been impacted, or maybe the hospital is the one that speaks up and says, we can't get linens when there's a snowstorm. Well, then we understand it's a supply chain impact. And so then the question is it any event where roads are impassable, or is it any event where supply chain is a problem? And so really what the ultimate concern or threat to the community is either loss of a vital service, such as the hospital, or it's some sort of a supply chain interruption. It's not actually the snowstorm. My other example I've given you is medical gas. If 6 hospitals have medical gas failure on their risk assessment or their vulnerability assessment, is there a regional risk of medical gas failure? And the same is true with active threat and active assailant. Lots of people have that on their individual jurisdictional HVA. Do some root cause analysis and understand, is it actually the medical surge that's the problem? Is it loss of key agencies? Public health says active threat or active assailant at our facility is our concern. Then is the concern to the community loss of the public health agency? Because the community's concern is probably not a medical surge of 3 to 10 patients. The community's concern is more about losing those key functions and key support agencies. Bomb threats are the same way. We all have bomb threat on our HVA, but one bomb threat disrupting one organization for several hours is not really a regional concern. And so that's where we got to think through the big picture of this. An example of that, this does a nice job. The 2 examples I'm going to show you, the MDH agency impact tool lists biological attack, infectious disease, and information system failure at the top of their concerns, right, as an agency. But as a community, biological attack, infectious disease, major power outage, those are also listed toward the top. Active shooter, though, you notice, is very much down at the bottom because it's not as much of a community impact as it might be, I'm going to back up a slide, as it might be in an agency. And so here you see the agency's concern is power outage and snowstorm, those sorts of things, because that's what impacts the agency. Here, what impacts the community are similar, but not necessarily the same. So you've done that, you go through and you identify then what could we improve as a community? One of the things that the workshop pushes you through is to identify your areas for improvement and assess your current capabilities. And again, it tells you to locate some members in the jurisdiction, develop your list of the top strengths and areas for improvement, and record those. Doesn't give you a lot of detail other than you're trying to look at strengths and areas for improvement. Again, you're focusing on jurisdiction, not individual agencies. The agency focus is about planning and internal training. The jurisdictional focus might be more about communications and incident command training. And so you think bigger picture on some of these. The workshop says that you want to look at external sources and requirements, whether it's strategy or grant funding or industry reports. And you're doing the same thing. You're just brainstorming to say, hey, what are all the things that are required of us as a jurisdiction? No different than you're brainstorming to say, what are the accreditation standards and regulations that are being required of us as a jurisdiction? So my suggestion is that you look at some of this stuff ahead of time. And actually, this slide says it's regarding the previous two slides, but honestly, everything we've talked about for assessing vulnerability and assessing all of the preparedness priority considerations is something that could be done in advance of the workshop. And you could have people compile, what are we required to do? What do we as an organization need to do in the next 3 years? And year over year, that list may not change because they're going to have the same accreditation standards, a lot of the same grant funding standards, or if they're on a 5-year grant cycle. So you could use your list from previous workshops. But I would suggest that for all of this, as you're trying to identify the preparedness priority factors, that's the activity one we just walked through, as you're trying to do that, I would suggest some homework, and you have everybody go through, all your participants, and prepare for this so that you spend a very short period of time. You're all in agreement. By the time you get there, you're in agreement that you need to work on incident management, you need to work on something around communications, you need to work on something around pediatric medical surge or a particular hazard that's been identified, but you're not spending the time in the workshop to identify all of your preparedness priority factors. That way you can begin to focus on activity 2, which is establishing the preparedness priorities. So those are those strategic high-level priorities that guide your preparedness activity. Now, some of this, again, could be done virtually or by homework because they're whole community and they're big picture, and they're going to be derived from a series of input factors or influences. So the activity that's assigned to you in the HSEAT process is to look ahead and get consensus on those priorities for the next 3 years, 5 years, whatever it is. And you see the considerations there are the factors that were identified in activity 1 and senior leader guidance. So if we're going to try to narrow the focus a little bit, one thing you can do is immediately eliminate some of the capabilities that don't need as much work. This is where your after-action reports and improvement plans are valuable because you can see some of your strengths that have been displayed across the community, or you can just collectively have people identify and say, what are your least focused capabilities right now? And then you can identify some very obvious needs. So recovery is something that perhaps every organization says, hey, we have a weakness in the area of recovery. But a lot of them may say, we have gaps in our plans, although they may not be the same planning gap. But if a lot of people say planning, you know that recovery and planning are two areas that you need to focus on. Remember, though, that anything you're doing for improvement is still that, it's improvement. So don't get tangled up in the minuscule difference of opinion between two individuals. Get it on paper, and I say this about after-action reports and improvement plans as well. Just get some things on paper. You can always fine-tune and you can always adjust as you go through the process. Once you conduct a few trainings or a couple of exercises, this is not set in stone for 3 years or 5 years or even a year. You can make adjustments. And so I would say, again, homework, because somebody's going to have a strong senior leader that says we need to focus on this, and somebody else, their senior leaders are going to say, oh, we're good with generally meeting our capabilities. And so if you have that difference of opinion or difference of approach, that's okay. Just capture some of those big picture things and try to move forward. Your goal is, again, ideally before the workshop even happens, you're identifying your factors for consideration and you are establishing your preparedness priorities, or pretty close. That way, if you've done some emailing, some virtual workshops, some conversation before, then when you get to activity 3 about developing the multi-year schedule, you have a good foundation laid. So that's where I want to talk about developing that multi-year schedule. It's the preparedness activities that you're using to address activity 2. So if you went through some of your factors for consideration and then your preparedness priorities ahead of time, when you get together, you say, hey, everybody, here's a quick review of those things. And now we're going to try to outline how we can accomplish that through planning, training, exercise, etc. It's a schedule that we're trying to accomplish. So that activity 3, the overview, and I'm going to walk through each of these, but we're going to identify some planning elements, identify some equipment elements, identify some potential exercises. We're going to look at some organizational structure elements. We want to identify some training opportunities. We want to update and build a multi-year schedule. That's activity 3, is all 6 of those things. So you can see why it's beneficial to do some legwork ahead of time. Otherwise, this becomes a long day trying to complete each of these activities. If we're trying to look at planning activities, again, you might have the large group or the small group, but the number 2 instruction is discuss what plans, policies, procedures, and checklists need to be reviewed, updated, or written in the next blank number of years. That's what you're trying to accomplish. So think about things like, could we combine 2 exercises, right? Again, you're not splitting hairs over every single exercise and training, but what you can say is, okay, big picture across the group, what are the exercises? Okay, public health, you have an exercise around botulism that you want to do because you have some new policy and procedure on something like that, or on receiving antitoxin through the airport and your security processes. And maybe meanwhile, the hospital says they have something that's related to reporting and foodborne outbreaks or food poisoning or something like that. And you might hear a theme and realize that you could combine an exercise there. The hospital may take more of a tabletop or discussion-based participation, functional exercise, but you as public health may take a full-scale exercise where you're actually driving to the airport, meeting a security person at the tarmac to pick up antitoxin and simulating all of that. That's okay, but then the communication becomes more realistic for all of you as you're communicating between public health and hospital, et cetera. You might have the same planning process or the same consultant that you hire or the same people that are going to be on a planning team to accomplish 2 different plans. So if people are talking about pediatric medical surge, you might be able to combine those planning efforts. Or somebody says, hey, we have this plan content, it's similar to what you need, and so we'll share as much as we can with you, and then the agencies can work together on updating their plans. And obviously, I say once properly updated for the other agency, of course. What I mean is if agency A doesn't have their information updated, it's not really worth sharing, right? Somebody's got to start and get their plan updated or work together to get it updated so that then the rest of us could build off of that. This whole process is very similar throughout the workshop as we're doing this. We're looking at structural elements that might change. And what we mean by structural elements is, are there organizational structures, whether that's because one agency has moved under another, maybe there's a new grant requirement that says now public health, you must do these things, and that's new. Or maybe some people are going to retire or some staff are going to turn over, and that's going to change the STP, the same 10 people. It may also change how they work together. Or we have a client who one of their key people went from state public health to state emergency management. And that was a big change, doing a very similar job, but under a different organization with a different perspective. As you look at that, you're going to talk through grant deliverables dictating the timing and personnel changes. So somebody might say, hey, we need to pump the brakes on this because we're going to have an interim director of X program for the next 6 weeks or 6 months. Or maybe it's that somebody's going to retire and we really need to get this done before they do so that we don't have to pause and wait for the hiring process and a new person to get oriented. The same is true with equipment. If we're looking at structural changes, we need to look at equipment and things like radio equipment or communications equipment or bed tracking software or something like that. There are grants, and so sometimes people say, hey, we need to wait on this grant, or we have this grant in motion, but that's taking time. The other opportunity around equipment and the advantage to doing this is if somebody says, hey, we have an interest in new whatever equipment, some sort of new air monitoring equipment. If another organization has the same interest or the same need, that's where you might say, hey, let's apply jointly for a grant. There also may be some people who say, hey, by the end of the year, we'll know how much money we're going to have, but we're going to be spending down some funds because this grant's coming to an end and we have surplus dollars. And so in this instance, what we're looking at is trying to build capacity for equipment. But remember that the reason that we're talking about this in the realm of the integrated preparedness is that we don't want to forget about capability. So if we buy equipment, we have to plan or write the plans to use it. We have to supply the training and education to effectively utilize the equipment. And then we have to exercise to demonstrate our capability that our plans and training were in fact effective, and we do know how to implement or utilize the new equipment or the new structure or whatever. If we have a new incident management structure or patient tracking structure or process, any of that. So capability and capacity become very important. And so your goal with this workshop is to help people understand or accomplish both capability and capacity, which plays very well into one of the steps is identifying potential training. Because again, we can say we have lots of stuff, or we have a structure, or we have a plan, but do people know that plan? Can they carry out that structure or implement that structure? So I'll harp again on capability and capacity. Just because you have it doesn't mean it's reducing vulnerability. You have to plan, you have to train, you have to exercise. Look at what's scheduled. Maybe there's an opportunity, and this is why it's helpful for people to come prepared to the workshop so they can say, we have these 3 exercises or these 4 trainings scheduled. And somebody else goes, oh, could we expand that training and bring some of our people into that training as well? I have been a part of these conversations where we've had to alter the schedule so that training occurs before an exercise, because somebody had an exercise established. Another organization said, we'd like to get in on that exercise, but we need to get some people trained. Or somebody says, we'd like to get in on that, but we need to convert the training to a train the trainer, because we got to get a lot of people trained and you only have 2 trainings scheduled. Could those 2 trainings become train the trainer so that our organization could expand the educational opportunities on our own? So there's a lot of opportunity here. It's just a collaborative effort to try to maximize the training, again, to ensure capability and capacity. Exercises are no different. I can say almost the same things about exercises as I did about training. I will say with exercises, please, I encourage you, objectives, objectives, objectives. Define the objective of the exercise before you define the scenario. So if somebody says, hey, we really need to test this new plan, that is essentially the objective. Then you can say, okay, that plan is about mass notification. There are lots of scenarios where we could test mass notification. But if somebody says, hey, we also need to test mass notification, but we need to do it as it relates to severe weather for whatever purpose, then you can write your scenario around severe weather. You can meet the mass notification requirement as opposed to like active shooter or something. And also, when you start talking about exercises, consider you have been talking about training and equipping and planning and changes to organizational structure. So that might set some objectives for some exercises. If you need to test a new organizational structure, a new patient tracking or bed tracking or bed management software or process, or a new process for managing patient loads during medical surge, that might impact your exercises. So don't forget about those. And I just want to encourage you, please avoid with your exercises jelly of the month. And what I mean is don't hop from thing to thing to thing. finish what you started before you get into a new topic, where possible. And I know that sometimes your senior leaders and your grant deliverables and stuff force you to that. And I keep using pediatric medical surge as an example, but I know lots of communities where pediatric medical surge was the jelly of the month. And they started down that road and they did some things, and then now it's just not complete and it's just going to die. And in 2 years, they'll have to recreate all of those same things when pediatric medical surge becomes an issue again. So I would encourage you to look at your exercises and say, are they helping to complete the cycle of the equipping or planning or training or something that we started? So then you're going to just build that schedule, and it's literally that schedule I showed you earlier that has the timeline associated with it and some details. Look at the things you can do together to maximize time or funding or even just the opportunity, like a subject matter expert that you're going to have present. And then look at the logical order. You know, if you're doing assessment, planning, training, and education, and then exercise, I would suggest that being a logical progression, that you don't then try to cram an exercise at the beginning and then do some assessment, and then you do some training, and then you decide you're going to plan, but try to do things in a logical order so that they complement one another, and hopefully that creates some efficiency. And the same would be true for your exercises. HTEP suggests that we do discussion-based exercises before operations-based exercises. It's not required, and sometimes we might do an operations-based exercise to help write a plan or a process, but typically we would think about talking through it and exploring it in a discussion-based exercise before we try to explore it with an operations-based exercise. Your schedule might look something like this, where this is 1 month. It's an example schedule only. You would duplicate it for months 2, 3, 4, and 5, but you see over on the left, the activity is plan, organize, equip, train, and exercise. Those are the things we just talked about. And then they are prioritized 1 through 5. So there's a priority 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plan for month 1. There's an organized priority 1 through 5 for month 1. So in 3 activities, we've identified our factors for consideration, we've established our preparedness priorities, and we've developed a multi-year schedule. And then we got to figure out how to do some reporting around this, and we're almost done. If activity 4 then is, how are we going to be accountable? We've got to determine the methodology for prioritizing, assigning, monitoring, tracking, and reporting our progress. And again, this helps all of you. If you notice the last thing, capability improvement projects and overall impact these actions have on capabilities, those are your individual organization capabilities across the jurisdiction. So this tracking, if everybody contributes during the workshop and then contributes in the tracking process, it should minimize the amount of activity that each of you has for your own monitoring and tracking as an individual participant. Consider compiling and recording areas for improvement from your exercises. Determine the actions and linking capabilities that are needed to address those areas for improvement. And what we mean is, if you said, hey, this is the area for improvement, put a capability to that. Or if you said, this is the corrective action, assign that a capability, because then you can look and see, ooh, 5 of us have the same capability. Maybe we can work and report in on that capability at the same time. You are prioritizing, assigning, tracking, reporting, and updating corrective action progress, which means somebody's got to write down your corrective actions and then look back at them. So this is where over some period of time, you're looking at those things, your corrective actions from your exercises. You're incorporating changes, completed corrective actions, and identified potential best practices and lessons learned into your future IPP or your integrated preparedness cycle. In other words, we're looking now to say, hey, what got done? And we can check that off, but then that helps us the next time we convene about this integrated preparedness plan. The next time we convene, we can say, we still need to work on these things. So it's really just reporting. And then your workshop will conclude with some review where you're focusing on ensuring proposed preparedness activities are actually supporting your priorities. And you'll kind of talk through and give a final next steps, which is the next slide. But as you talk through your review, you want to make sure that you're looking for and identifying any overlap. You're looking for opportunities to share resources. And I've been talking about that. That's sort of the final step in your workshop. And then you're going to develop the summary of the workshop so that you can then create the integrated preparedness plan. I suggest that everybody has a clear list of items to accomplish and the date for the next meeting. I would suggest that you not only have your date for the next meeting for the preparedness plan, but that you go ahead and set like some review dates far out in the future and go ahead and get those things on your calendars. So that's your activity 4. We've gone through the workshop. Let me just give you a couple of nuggets of wisdom about going through the process. I've alluded to small bites. I highly recommend that you try to not sit down and bang this out in a 10-hour day. Consider a couple of meetings or consider some homework. Don't get hung up on one issue. If it looks like you're hung up on something, just table it and keep going. It's better to get it all written down, and those things seem to work themselves out in my experience. Think big picture about jurisdiction, not individual agency. And so that's the medical gas failure active shooter thing. You're trying to think about what impacts the jurisdiction as a whole. Focus, please, on capability and capacity. So don't just think we need to buy some stuff or we need to run an exercise because what we need to do is run an exercise to demonstrate that we know how to do it. If you buy a new fire truck and nobody knows how to operate it, what you have is capacity and no capability. You need to have and you want to be able to demonstrate that we can get water effectively and efficiently out of the fire truck, that people can drive the fire truck and get it to the scene safely. Focus on trying to have the training and exercising that accomplishes both of those things. I really believe you need a dedicated, experienced facilitator. Don't try to do this with a group without somebody who's dedicated as your or identified as your facilitator, and it probably shouldn't be their first time facilitating. Get a few people in there to just be a scribe or a note taker. Go prepared with sticky notes and whiteboards and think of this as a visual brainstorming session. There are lots of electronic systems, SurveyMonkey and JotForm and Poll Everywhere and things that you can use to gather data and information, and think about how you could incorporate that before or during the workshop. Or maybe you have 2 virtual workshops and then the in-person workshop or something. And then the other part is get the right people there. Try to think through those situations where somebody's going to say, if my boss were here, or I need to call my boss, or we need to get an answer from this person, and try to get those people there, have them attend. Last slide, there is a prep toolkit that has IPPW materials, and they can be modified. And so the PowerPoint for that's going to look a lot like the slides that I presented today in terms of content. You could start with what we provided you and some of the considerations and build your own workshop. This is a list of things that are included in that toolkit. I'm not going to go through each of them individually, but just to give you an idea, there's a presentation, there's a user guide, there's an example of an integrated preparedness plan. You don't have to start on your own. And honestly, it probably makes sense for you to listen to this webinar, go look through these tools, and then refer back to this webinar and try to build your schedule based on some of those tips if you've never done this. I say all that to say, I appreciate you riding through an hour of this, and this is a lot. And we know that this was designed to be something that you might listen to or look back at and refer back to. But that is my email address and our office phone number. So should you have any questions, even if it's in a year from now, feel free to reach out. I'm happy to try to provide some resources or some ideas or connect you with some counterparts who have been through the process and help you with this. With that, I will say good luck with this. It is a wonderful process if you can get your community on the same page where you are in fact building both capability and capacity. And as a taxpayer, we all appreciate that, and it makes the money feel well used. But just by way of encouragement, it also, for any of us who may ever be in the situation where we are impacted by a disaster, it feels safe to be in a place where capability and capacity were really thought out and planned out so that the response when the bad thing happens is truly effective. So thank you for your effort to try to create an integrated preparedness plan, and good luck with your IPPW.